Hello, everybody, and welcome to Peace of Mind, Suicidal Doctor, The Ultimate Paradox. Thank you for tuning in. This is in collaboration with Nicole from Mental Health of Medics, and we bring to you the first episode of this dual series of webinars and podcasts, raising awareness about mental health and well-being. Today, we are joined by our guest speaker, Dr. Gerada, who's a UK-based GP and the chair of the UK charity Doctors in Distress, who will join us on this discussion about suicide in the medical profession. We'll have some time at the end of the session for some follow-up questions, so you can either send them through the Q&A box or raising your hand at the end when we say we will be having the questions.
So, hello, Dr. Gerada, welcome. Just to put everyone in the picture, she was chair of the Royal College of General Practitioners from 2010 to 2013. She's a GP, but with training in psychiatry. And she's currently chair of Doctors in Distress, which is a charity which aims to reduce suicides amongst doctors and other healthcare professionals. So, Dr. Gerada, welcome.
Thank you.
So you have a Maltese surname, but a British accent. So where does the Maltese heritage come from?
Yes, well, my mother was from Slema and my father was from Zaytoun. And when my father was a doctor, and as soon as he qualified, after he did his house jobs, he left Malta with my mother and went to live in Nigeria and spent the next 15 years there. Now, it's hard to believe, but at the time, neither of my parents spoke. I mean, they spoke Maltese, of course they did, but Maltese was not the main language in Malta, and my mother wasn't taught Maltese. It wasn't the language that was spoken in schools, and so they never spoke to us in Maltese. They spoke to us in English, and I always regret this. And then they moved to England. Now, in the last 2 years, I have been trying to study Maltese, and it is the hardest language ever to study. It is. So I can hear it and I can understand it, but I'm frightened of speaking it. And I've had to, since COVID, give up my lessons because I've been so busy. But I'm Maltese. I have a Maltese passport. You're the only place that never asks me how to spell my surname or indeed how to pronounce it. So whenever I'm on anywhere, I have to say it's a G, a soft G, like giraffe. So that's what I always say, except when I'm in Malta. When, of course, everybody knows I'm Maltese. So I'm proud of my Maltese heritage. I love Malta. I before COVID, would go every month, every 6 weeks. I haven't been there since January, and I miss you so much.
We're very happy to have you here as well, talking to the Maltese students and doctors. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Gerada is chair of Doctors in Distress. And their aim is to have 0 suicides amongst doctors by 2025. Now that's quite an ambitious aim, Dr. Gerada. So what's Doctors in Distress and how do you plan on achieving the same?
Yeah, thank you. It's a charity that I took over just a few months ago, and it was set up by Amandip Sidhu, whose brother was a consultant cardiologist who sadly killed himself. And his brother killed himself really because, to put it in a nutshell, he was overworked and he developed burnout, and he sadly drove himself to Beachy Head and killed himself. So Amandip set up the charity, and I really started to help him, and then it seemed to be, given my experience of caring for doctors, of running a service for doctors with mental illness for the last decade, I've taken it over and am now fundraising and setting up what its parameters are. So the way we're going to try and reduce suicide is one is reducing stigma, but also trying to create what I call groups of belonging. So doctors, medical students can come together in spaces where they can talk about the impact of their work, because I unbelievably and fundamentally believe that a problem shared is a problem halved. And if we can get off the busy track that we're all on and actually sit back and talk about what it means to hold a dying patient's hand, what it means to be seen your 15th, 20th patient of the day, what it means to get a complaint, then it might actually go some way in stopping doctors killing themselves. So I took over this charity in May of this year, and it's grown and grown and grown, and I'm very proud to be running it. And I just have a wonderful team around me who give most of their time for free, and we're developing. So if you go on the internet and have a look at Doctors in Distress, you'll see about the charity, and if you really want to, you can donate some money. But if not, you can come to my launch event of my book, which is on Thursday evening, Beneath the White Coat: Doctors, Their Minds and Mental Health, and all the proceeds will be going to the charity.
That's fantastic. Ultimately, so the aim is suicide awareness and prevention, and we were talking about why this is important. And like, we have statistics that one doctor dies by suicide every 3 weeks. So really, it's
in England. In America, I think it's one a week. It depends, of course, on the size of the population. It's very difficult to know the exact figures. Really is difficult. All sorts of reasons. If a doctor kills themselves, the coroner might be reluctant to put suicide on the death certificate. Single, I mean, you won't have it in Malta because you don't have motorways, but you know, we know that single occupancy car crashes have a much higher incidence of being suicide than an accident, and all sorts of issues why it's certainly underreported. But certainly, if you think about doctors, and those listening now will be doctors and medical students, doctors should have a lower rate of suicide than the general population, because on the whole, we tend to be intelligent, you know, we tend to have a good social network, even if it's just colleagues at work. We tend to have a prestigious job. On the whole, we're reasonably well paid, and we tend to have a job that's secure. So and it's difficult to become a doctor if you, for example, have had a life of you know, being in care or using drugs as in your early days. So we tend to have very good prognostic factors rather than heavy on risk factors. Yet, certainly amongst women doctors who have a much higher rate of suicide than their peers, and male doctors, it's either just about the same or maybe a tiny bit lower, but it should be considerably lower if you think about where we sit in society. So it is a serious problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, when we were brainstorming for this program, we reached out to the National Statistics Office for statistics on suicide in Malta, and if they had any about physicians or suicide of those in the medical field, and they had absolutely none whatsoever. And even in in Malta, suicide isn't reported at all or even spoke about often. So that's why we wanted to do
I
this.
think that's right, Katrina, because I think I mean, we know that suicide, certainly, I mean, let's not be depressing at the moment, but certainly suicide till certainly my lifetime was in England was an illegal act, and or attempting to take your own life. And we know in the Catholic Church, suicide it was frowned upon and considered to be a deep sin. So it's not discussed. It's really is stigmatizing to take your own life. Of course it is. But also those left behind are stigmatized. And I run a group for those bereaved following the death through suicide of a doctor. And you have the double whammy there. You have a doctor who's killed themselves, or a medical student, and then you have the bereaved who have, in a vicarious way, are sometimes blamed and think, well, why didn't you notice? Why did your GP son or daughter, they should know better, sort of thing. So it is important we talk about it. And I would imagine everybody listening to this call, if you're in the medical world, will have had suicidal thoughts, because it's very common in medicine. It's very, very common. And what's important is that suicidal thoughts don't necessarily translate into suicide, but it's about discussing in safe spaces about why one may be plagued with thoughts, suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree. I know like a lot of friends who have struggled with mental health problems, and these in turn, even just the setting of our medical school and the pressure we're under, can ultimately lead to suicide. And even I feel like my friends and family who aren't in medicine go through these things, but like the point is today, people in medicine and in the medical field, be it students or doctors, are often more at risk, especially since we are exposed to higher levels of personal and professional stress, I think. um Being a woman in healthcare, do you think female doctors are at a higher risk of suicide?
Katrina, we are at a higher risk of suicide. We know that from the figures. We're the only group where men and women have the same rate, and because on the whole, men tend to have a much higher rate of suicide than women. But in medicine, it's about the same. Now, there's lots of thoughts as to why. In the early days, it was thought, well, maybe because there's more women entering medicine and maybe we're being discriminated against because there's so few women. But now, I don't know about Malta, but certainly in England, we're about equal. In some specialties, general practice, there are more women than men. And I don't want to be simplistic about this, but I am going to be simplistic. I think women have a tougher time of it because come what may, we still tend to be the child carers. We still tend to look after our elders. We still have to juggle the academic work with the nappies. If the washing machine breaks down, it's still the woman that has to sort out, you know, maybe not in Malta, but certainly where I am. And there is still a macho culture, a very masculine, I don't being insulting to men, by the way, but a very sort of male type of culture in medicine where unless you're prepared to work very, very long hours and sacrifice yourself, then you're not cut out for the profession. And I think this is probably what puts women at greater risk. There are many other factors, and I'd be interested in your views, but I think those are the main factors. It's certainly not, and we both have the same means, because clearly a female doctor and a male doctor both has the same means of access to drugs. But where others have the same means, such as vets, you don't see a higher rate in female vets compared to male vets. So there is certainly something about women doctors and our position in medicine, and our position as the person that has to give up more of themselves to do the caring in spaces outside the workplace.
I think it's still quite similar to the situation in Malta. I think women are often seen as the ones who will give up their career and focus on family rather than the male. Going forward, what do you think could be done to reduce the risk of females committing suicide?
Female, well, I think it's very difficult, by the way, to give specific, areas. If we say, what can we do to lower the risk right across the board? Again, I'm not sure what your workplace is like, but our workplace before COVID was a pretty difficult place to work in. The intensity of the work that we had to do, the hours, the fatigue, the numbers of complaints, the regulatory framework was just insurmountable. It's unsustainable. And I think a lot of doctors were becoming mentally ill. We know that from the figures in our health service. Now, I came to Malta, the last time I was in Malta, I went to visit the Malta Medical Association to look at, they were going to set up an initiative to support doctors because they were picking up the same issues of burnout, depression, anxiety. I don't know whether that has taken off because then of course COVID came along, but I know your working lives are very difficult. I know that your shift working is very difficult, your lack of spaces where you can come together. So if you're going to reduce the rate of suicide, you have to improve the working environment. There is no two ways about this. There's absolutely no two ways. You have to push the curve so fewer people are unhappy, fewer people are burnt out. And then what you have to do is to pick out those who are particularly at risk. And there are some groups, even within your own, in a tiny island like Malta, who are more at risk. So we've already talked about women. Your international medical graduates, of which you have many, will be at risk because they've had to come to Malta. They won't have links with Malta. It's a different language. I know they speak English, but it's still a different language, a different culture. And so they're more at risk. And then you have to start picking out people who identify themselves as severely distressed and give them access to a confidential service. So there's lots of things that you need to do. It's not just about giving a screening test to saying, are you suicidal or not? That won't pick anybody up. In fact, it'll do the complete opposite. It's about making the culture in which you work a safer culture. It's about allowing you the space and time to talk about issues that are difficult. And it's about identifying those that we know are at more risk and maybe putting in special services for them. But also, all of you need to have access to a confidential space, because I know in Malta from when I was there last, you know, if you've got a heart problem there, you go to your mate down the corridor and down the ward. You don't go off and see a GP and have a proper consultation. You have these corridor consultations, and it's very difficult to have a corridor consultation if you say, look, I'm drinking a bottle of wine every night. You need a special place to go and talk about that, even if it is nice master wine.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's quite common of our Maltese culture, and everyone knows everything about each other.
Which is terrible, because how can everyone, let's assume that you're a female doctor and you're going home in the evening and your husband is abusive, and he might be gambling too much and he's drinking too much and he's abusive to you. You need to be able to have a confidential space where you can talk about that isn't someone that is going to go and disclose that or gossip about it at a party or with their friends. And until you put that in place, it's very difficult for doctors, and I would actually say for medical students as well, to access care.
Definitely. I think it definitely comes down to the system, like our healthcare system and its structure, and all that we have put in place. At university, there is a counseling service available that's free, and completely confidential.
Good. And it has to be completely confidential, I think, because actually otherwise you're going to access care. So I think it is about that. There are, you're a very small island and very few of you, so you do all know your business. But on the flip of that, you do know when somebody's struggling, or you should know when somebody's struggling. And in a way, you might be in a better position to put your arms around them metaphorically and to start to support them.
Adding on to how we should know when someone is struggling, although you had said that the rate of suicide is like level between males and females in healthcare.
Yeah.
I think in general, males are less likely to seek help and more likely to resort to suicide. This might be often because of the notion that males need to be like self-assured, confident, dominant at all times, which in turn often makes them refrain from like discussing their emotions and internalizing them. I think this could also be like worked upon in our system and our culture that we have in Malta to tackle the issue of males not speaking up from the get-go and normalize seeking help.
Yeah, I mean, but as I said, male and female doctors have the same rates. It's absolutely clear. Women doctors have a higher rate than their female counterparts, and women in the general population have a far lower rate of suicide than men. So to have the same rate means that female doctors have a higher rate overall. So when it comes to medicine, suicide is chosen. That's a horrible word, but you understand what I mean. It's chosen as an end point for both men and women doctors. I think what you're talking about is men find it much harder to approach treatment services and much harder to speak up about emotional issues. Now, women are conditioned to seeking help because we seek help from get-go. We seek help for contraception, we seek help for maternity, we seek help for the menopause. So menopause, and we take our children to seek help. So we're much more acclimatized to actually becoming a patient or a proxy patient, whereas men, and we know this from men right across the board, they're far more reluctant to attend any health service. They don't go for their prostate cancer, for prostate checks. They don't go for their testicular cancer. They don't go for their heart disease. They stand back, and they're not as familiar with attending services. Or when it comes to mental health services, absolutely no, if they're not going to go and talk about their cardiac pain, they're hardly going to talk about their mental pain. So we have to try and talk about it together, or we have to normalize it. And as I said, talking together in your peer groups, discussing the last complaint you had or the difficult patient you had, you might find that the male doctors are able just as easily as the female to speak up and say, yeah, that doctor made me feel terrible, that patient made me feel terrible. I went home and I dreamt about them, and oh my God, that complaint, I really feel terrible. I keep thinking about, I'm going to lose my career, and catastrophizing. So if we put some spaces where people can talk about what's going on, I think we'll go some way to improving men's attendance at services. But men on the whole have higher rates of addiction. And so I think they certainly suffer, but they may drink their way through their suffering. I don't know in Malta whether you have a drugs problem, but they may also take drugs through so they may use all sorts of drugs, over-the-counter drugs, or even much more complex drugs such as cocaine, amphetamines, and even opiates. So I think for doctors, it's about providing safe spaces to talk about distress for men and women, and to use each other as your support. I don't know whether you've heard of Bannock groups. Do you know about Bannock groups, which was groups
Yes,
where you...
I've heard of them.
Well, it's groups where small groups, usually no more than 10 of you together, somebody brings in a patient, metaphorically brings in a patient, and it's not there as a presentation like, there's a 36-year-old man with central crushing chest pain. This is my patient, he makes me feel this, he's got 3 children, this is what he's doing to me. And you discuss what the interaction is between the patient, their illness, and you as the practitioner. And Michael Balint was a famous doctor in the 1950s in the UK and set up Balint groups where, and it's called the doctor, the patient, and the illness. And I think that is a really good way. If every single student could be part of a Balint group, you'd go some way to bringing in the sort of the softer aspects of care, which is also about the softer aspects of looking after oneself.
I think, as mental health of medics, it's one of our aims to have something similar, where doctors can go provide peer support and be able to grow with each other truly. And I feel like we're still far behind in terms of the stigma there is. I feel like it wouldn't work yet in Malta.
It wouldn't work, but you don't need to call them therapy groups. If you call them Balint groups, reflective practice group, peer support group, mindfulness groups, but any space where you can just be, and for 90 minutes you can sit and talk about the last patient you saw. You can talk about the angry consultant who bawled you out. You can talk about the complaint that you had that's reverberating around. You can talk about the dark thoughts you're having. So if you call it therapy, I'm not sure therapy as such is very well developed in Malta. In my day when I used to go to Malta a lot, it was the local priest that did the therapy. Well, I suspect that a 23-year-old medical student is hardly going to go to their priest and say, I'm struggling at work. So there are services, but it may be something that you as the next generation of doctors can start to agitate and to think about getting funded through your government offices.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very, very true, and hopefully it is something as future doctors we can implement. So moving on, in medical school we hear this term of a perfect doctor. And we wonder sort of what is a perfect doctor, and is it harmful to believe that a perfect doctor exists so that we can strive towards being a perfect doctor?
I hope everybody listening to this has heard of Winnicott, who talked about the good enough mother. And it was a fabulous concept that there's no such thing as a perfect mother, there's just a good enough mother. And you have to be a good enough mother in order that the baby learns to develop their own coping strategies. Now, there is no such thing as the perfect doctor. There is a good enough doctor. And if any of you have read, there's a brilliant book that was published in the 1970s called House of God, and by somebody called Samuel Shen, if I can remember rightly. And there is a fabulous book which talks about the doctor, who's the senior doctor, is talking to the junior doctor, the house officer or the intern. And the intern is really panicking because they can't get through what they need to do. And the other intern managed to do it very, very quickly. And the senior doctor said, well, just cut corners, just do this, because actually you're already performing at a very, very high level already. And I think doctors forget that even good enough is very good, very, very good. And what we see in my sick doctor service, and I have to be gendered, it's mainly amongst women, is this strive for perfection, is the fact that even a spelling error in their notes sends them into a cataclysm of anxiety, let alone leaving something till tomorrow, which doesn't need to be done today. And they find it impossible to hand over, impossible to manage risk and uncertainty. And the one lesson I would give every single person listening to this is learn to be good enough, because if you think you're going to be perfect, you will never survive. The imperfection of medicine, because medicine is the most imperfect specialty, which I was taught by my father, who's a doctor. It's an art as well as a science, and you know that art is not perfect. It's in the eye of the beholder. And we choose you, by the way, to be perfect. And you have to, I don't know what your entry, how many you have per year, but it can't be very many. 100 per year, 50 per year. So you're already highly intelligent. You've already done so much to get into medical school. And so we choose you for these perfect trays. We then put you in an environment where you can perform at a very, very high level. We don't stop you because people like perfectionists in their team. And so sadly, the whole system combined with the personality drives this sense of perfection, and it's the biggest predictor of burnout and leaving the profession.
I completely agree. I think it's a system problem rather than a personal problem, and that's what we fail to realize, especially in Malta. In fact, there was a study, we don't have a lot of studies on doctor burnout and mental health of doctors. However, there was a study in 2013 which basically showed that almost 50% of newly graduated doctors had been suffering from significant psychological distress. And
Yeah.
I think that's very significant.
Yes, and you can address it, but people listening to this will say, well, of course we need to be perfectionists because we don't, we'll be sued. You won't be sued. I have to be personally, I'm still working, so touch wood. I'm not a perfectionist, absolutely not. And certainly early on in your career, you take longer doing things. You have to take longer. But if somebody asked me about, one of the questions was about picking up science, and I'll tell you now, if you're staying 2 hours or more longer on a regular basis, if you're going into the ward when you shouldn't be there, so when you're not on duty, or ringing up the ward to check on something, then seek help, because I think what you're doing then is you are falling into this trap of perfectionism. You're falling into and there's maybe good and bad perfectionism, but you're falling into the trap of bad, maladaptive perfectionism where you can't leave anything to be, and it will only get worse. So the trigger signs we see for doctors who come to my service, if they're 2 hours or more on a regular basis, going in early or staying late, then just have a little flag in your head. What's going on here? Now, clearly in the middle of a COVID pandemic, you might do that. But this is on a regular basis to check on your actions, to ring up, the mother of a child you discharged, were they all right? That is when it gets worrying, because then it means you can't stand back and you won't be able to survive as a doctor, because medicine is so uncertain and so imperfect.
Mm-hmm. I think those are very wise words, honestly. And as we said before, the problem starts from medical school. And we have a lot of sort of rules, a lot of traditions, which maybe they're not the best for our mental health. Like, for example, ranking doctors, as in ranking medical students as soon as they graduate to have a job. The lack of focus on clinical skills and certain exam systems with negative marking, they all put extra pressure on already very stressed out students.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And it's even before medical school, of course, because you have to be perfect. You can't have a criminal record. You can't have got I don't know what your grading is at school, but you can't have an E grade. You can't have a bad report. You've got to be good at music, good at sports. You've probably got to attend church. You've all sorts of things to show that you're a very good person. That, of course, favours women more than men, because women tend to be more biddable than men. And then we put you in an environment where we test you. I don't know in Malta, but certainly in England, we test you every single term, more than that. More or less every few weeks you're tested, you're ranked, everything depends on these scores. And then we, as you said, put you through negative marking. On the whole, though, you can affect this, because all of you will get a job, whether you're number 1 or number 100. All of you unless you're right at the very top, then all of you will be average. The other problem is you were all very clever at school, so you're used to being top of the class in school, and now you're just average. And it's very difficult to be average when you're used to being top, and so you keep on working hard to be more than average, and of course somebody else is average or below average. But it is the system, and I think it's something about, again, affecting change. What we've done here, what I hope I've been doing, is talking about it. You shouldn't be ranked every single year that you're there. You shouldn't. We were ranked, but we didn't know it at all. And we weren't ranked, we had scores. So, but it does contribute to mental illness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with both of what you and Nicole were saying. I think it just comes down to the system of our university locally and even internationally. And even our medical curriculum as such doesn't really favor mental health of students. In Malta, we do have medical leadership seminars, which are run by David Kossar,
Who is a
psychiatrist.
fabulous person who came to the Maudsley, and I trained with him and the Maudsley in mental illness and psychiatry. But it's both of you. You see, it's all of you. We play this game of wanting to study harder, do better, and maybe it's about everybody stepping back a little and starting to understand that it is our mental health. I'm interested in what COVID has done to you all, though. Presumably, COVID has stopped this because I imagine amongst medical schools you aren't able to physically go in. So things have changed, have they?
Well, I mean, for some people it was better, for some people it was worse, honestly. We had to stop going there physically since like March, and we had online lectures. As clinical students, I'm speaking. But then we had to go in summer to compensate for what we lost during the months of March to May. And
Yeah.
our exams were online as well.
Yes, so it's all very difficult. But I would say to all of you, right, medicine has always been tough. If you buy my book, you'll see that we give a historical account. 100 years ago, there was a fabulous biography written by a Russian doctor who described his medical school training and then his first few years working in the hospital. And if you read this book, he doesn't call it burnout, but he describes unbelievable burnout and depression, and where 1 in 10 of his classmates killed themselves. So it has always been tough. What I think we're doing now is acknowledging that it's tough, and it shouldn't cause mental illness. And that's the worry, is that we've put up far too long with the idea that medical school training, the fact that it destroys people's emotional life, is irrelevant because they have to become a doctor. And I think this is where discussions such as this start to open up this issue, because you should not be risking your mental health when you're actually going to be serving mankind and helping them get better. Why should you sacrifice your own mental health and your own needs when already you're making enormous sacrifices along the way, in the hours you work, the length of your training, financial sacrifices, and all sorts of things along the way?
I think, you're very right. And I think that's why we named this episode Suicidal Doctor, the Ultimate Paradox, because it's to have a doctor who wants to kill themselves is just a paradox, like to have a barefoot shoemaker, a hungry chef, as Dr. Pamela Weibel says. And it's really just so counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive, and even on that, psychiatrists have a high rate of suicide if you look at the medical profession, and it is counterintuitive. It's something about I talk about, it's quite complex, but I talk about the fact that we are at high risk of mental illness and we don't attend services because we're inculcated from even before medical school to have self-sacrifice even before medical school. So the journey many of you have taken to get into medical school, and then at medical school, the hidden curriculum is about self-sacrifice, working hard, putting others first. And what happens then is that the flip of that is it gives you power, authority, but actually it also means you don't acknowledge any vulnerability, and you certainly don't seek help. So there is these two tensions that happen in the making of a doctor. The one is the invincibility, and the other is the fact that that invincibility allows you to do the job that patients and the public expect, but you're still inside this a vulnerable human being that has all the same needs as somebody else. So it is complex. It's a difficult space to be, but what I would say is the more that one can talk about it, and this isn't about breaking down and crying every time you see a dead body. Of course it's not, and you have to learn to not break down and cry every time you see a dead body, but it's about acknowledging that you have given up something because you don't break down when you see a dead body. Because if I took my son to see a dead body, he'd run screaming, whereas you've all seen dead bodies, and in that process you're going through a transformation, and part of that transformation is denying your vulnerability.
I couldn't agree more. We've all experienced that, and even as you progress through medicine, you encounter other situations which just make you harden as a person and grow stronger, even mentally. But sometimes it does take a toll on your mental
Katrina,
health.
you have to grow strong mentally. This is what I'm trying to say, is that there is a yin and a yang. You cannot not create your defense mechanisms, because you will be useless as a doctor. If every time you ran for a cardiac arrest and the patient died, you went on and off and had to take a week's sick leave to get over it, you're useless. Instead, what you probably learn to do is you learn to use black humor. You might laugh about it. You might what's called denial. You just sort of, this didn't really happen. You might dissociate. You won't feel it. And so there is a middle ground where that sort of feelings become too much and you become deadened, but where it becomes just enough and you're able to do your job and acknowledge. So that's why medicine is so difficult, because alongside all the knowledge that you have to learn this hidden curriculum. You have to learn these defense mechanisms. You have to learn to compartmentalize your emotions, because otherwise you're useless. One is useless. If you went to a road traffic accident and vomited, what sort of use, person, you would never survive as medicine. Doesn't mean it doesn't affect you. It just means you're dealing with it in a different way. And what I worry about at the moment is there's no space for you to process some of those emotions, even if it's processing them over a glass of wine with some friends in the evening. And that's what we need to be bringing back, is spaces where you can talk to each other formally and informally and say, wasn't that shit? The child died. I did my best. I felt gutted. Yep, let's get drunk together. I'm not advocating getting drunk, by the way.
No, I completely agree. There needs to be these spaces and the normalization to talk about these things, because ultimately we all go through it.
You all go through it, and you go through it at a very young age. I mean, I don't know how old the average person on here, but you think about this. You enter medical school at 18, you're barely out of childhood, and you come out the other end as a doctor at 23, 24, and you're having to deal with some of the most emotionally laden activities that nobody else wants to do. And you think it's normal. Surgeons, it's not normal to put a knife in someone, but yet you've learned to do it over the 6 years of your training. And that's what I hope that I can start to so students can start to understand what they're going through, but also the flip of that is that part of that training also is about denying your own vulnerability, your own emotional needs, and self-sacrificing where you shouldn't be self-sacrificing.
So with regards to the COVID pandemic, do you think it's going to make a difference in how we view doctors, and whether we've sort of noticed that, they can have a hard time too, or or do you think it's just we're just going to see it the same as we were seeing it before?
What, COVID amongst doctors? I mean, we know from other pandemics that doctors are ones, or health professionals, suffer the most in terms of mental distress. Again, I talk about need emotional PPE, psychological PPE, as well as physical PPE. I hope that the hospital, that Mater Dei and all the hospitals have put in emotional PPE, which is usually debriefing, spaces to talk, decompression rooms, places that you can sleep, hot food at night, as well as the physical PPE. I think that I think doctors, I don't know about you medical students, but you're exhausted after the last batch, and I don't think many of the medical profession fully recovered from the first wave. You in Malta, of course, have had unbelievably high rates in the last. That's why I didn't come to Malta this time. I should be in Malta today, but it would have meant isolating when I came home. So so again, I think that if it isn't already in place, you need to be agitating to put in some support for you going forward in the now, because actually otherwise it's going to be very tough.
I think, we do have some things in place, but it's just not enough for what we have to experience and what doctors go through. As in, I even, for example, I spoke to the lead of this trainee support team, which basically takes care of doctors during their foundation years. However, they told me that during the COVID pandemic, it had to stop because of the pandemic. So
The
it just
time it shouldn't stop.
exactly.
Listen, if anybody wants, if they go onto my website, we've got lots of material which you can access even from Malta. It's open for NHS.UK, and a lot of these are open events, and we've been putting on doctors' common rooms, medical student common rooms, COVID support groups. I'm running a long COVID group for doctors coming up shortly. Maybe this is what you need to be talking to David Kassar about. Can he run a COVID support group, or can he commission one to be run? Can he be putting doctors' common rooms together so you can be talking to each other about what's going on?
Yeah, very true, for sure. I think it's something we need to raise.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. Do you want me to answer them?
Yes, I was just about to say we can move on to the questions now. I think we have 2 sent in already.
Well, you've got one that's 2 questions. The Essa Assam.
Shall I read them out so everyone?
Yeah, why don't you read them out?
So the first, just for the record, and everyone can send in any questions they would like answered now, or you can raise your hand and hopefully we will cover them. So we have a question from Petros Viseri. Do you provide mindfulness trainings as support for doctors in the UK, or do you know of any UK studies specific to doctors and mindfulness? I am a wife to a doctor locally, and we found mindfulness key to our emotional well-being to support his profession and our personal life.
Yeah, there's lots and lots of studies around mindfulness as one of the interventions to improving well-being. But mindfulness is only useful if you find mindfulness useful. And I don't say that flippantly, but there's a lovely study that made it compulsory for medical students. And what they found was it actually made worse the levels of burnout, and the comments that came afterwards was, it took too much of my time, I wish I was doing other things. Now, the people that do best are the ones that like that form of intervention. Any intervention that takes you away from your workplace, that allows you the space to think about what you're doing, and to think about and to reflect, is helpful. And mindfulness is one, but so is swimming with dolphins, all sorts of things. So mindfulness is helpful. We don't, our service doesn't provide mindfulness, but there's many mindfulness programs. And again, if you look at our website, and I'm sure a lot of them are for free, you can access them. And mindfulness is a good technique, but it's not for everybody.
I hope that answered your question, Petra. We also have 3 other questions. One, are students within the spectrum of autism, or be it with ADHD or BPD, more prone to find a steady state of mental health difficult?
Okay, that's one question. Second one's the second one, so let's deal with that one. I just want to ask as to whether BPD is bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder, because they tend to be used as the same initial. I think it's borderline personality disorder, but if we take autism first, again, it's unusual to have autism as a doctor, but doctors do. My book has got a whole chapter on autism and medicine, written by a doctor who herself is autistic and herself runs a self-help group for doctors with autism. And doctors with autism have a much higher rate of suicide and a much higher rate of mental illness for all sorts of reasons which you can imagine, because if you've got problems processing and you go into a busy environment which is constantly changing, it distresses one. So yes, with ADHD and BPD, again, ADHD, I'm surprised how common it is in doctors. I'm not sure it does increase the risk of suicide, but one could say it certainly increases the risk of mental illness. And BPD, if you mean bipolar disorder, then doctors or anybody with bipolar disorder have a massively increased risk of suicide. So yes. If you say borderline personality disorder, well, we don't know how many doctors have got borderline personality disorder. On the whole, the rate of personality disorder amongst doctors is far, far lower than it is amongst the general population for obvious reasons. You know, if you commit crimes, if you're constantly acting out in any way, it's difficult to get into medicine, and it's difficult to sustain it.
Okay, and part two of the question is that how can medical students with mental disorders cope with medicine while going in a journey of self-reflection and emotional healing?
Have therapy. And I'm serious there. I think if that's, you know, if you feel that you have a mental disorder, if you've already got depression, anxiety, if you've got autism, ADHD, there, just like one goes to the gym to keep one's physical fitness ticking along, going to a therapist, a counsellor to keep one's mental health ticking along is probably the best thing you can do, either as an individual, so one-on-one, or even as a group. And I know that there's very little group work in Malta, but actually I think the best thing anybody can do to stay sane is self-reflection and emotional healing. Self-reflection is probably the most important, and it's difficult to do that with one's friends, because unless they're doctors, and it's very difficult. You can do it, but it tends to be something that is done with a professional group, and I think that's probably the best way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to answer the anonymous one? At what point are doctors with mental health issues deemed not fit to practice? Very, very good question. Very difficult to do it in a nutshell, but on the whole, there's an overlap, isn't there, between conduct, performance, and mental illness. And de facto, if you take addiction, it can impact on both conduct if you're stealing drugs from the ward or writing prescriptions, performance because clearly if you're bleary-eyed and you can't work, and then health because if you've got an addiction. My sense is that it's less often than you think that doctors with mental health are not fit to practice. People often say, yeah, but what if? In our experience, probably about 7% of doctors with mental health problems aren't fit to practice, and they tend to be addiction, though there are other groups such as borderline personality disorder. But it's something that one has to just look at very carefully on case. If your performance drops or you commit a crime, that would be saying that your mental illness is impacting on your ability to work as a doctor. And committing a crime is usually things such as stealing drugs, writing prescriptions, buying drugs on the internet and being addicted to opiates, or drinking a bottle and a half of wine on your way to work.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is actually related. So can foundation school make you disclose mental health struggles, and can you refuse to do so?
Yes, they can, and they shouldn't, and they can, but not mental health struggles. You should never have to disclose a mental health struggle ever. But if you, in our country, they do ask about previous access to counselling or other services. And sadly, I think it's very wrong that they do, but they do. And can you refuse to do so? It's difficult, because what you could do is you could write in that box previous issues, sought help, full insight, and just put something, because on a personal level I wouldn't want to disclose anything, but it's very difficult. But again, for medical students listening to this, medical students are very honest and they tend to over disclose, and I think before you do disclose something, talk to somebody and say, do I need to really disclose? I certainly wouldn't disclose if you saw a counsellor because you split up with your boyfriend and had 4 or 5 sessions, but if you'd taken 6 months off because you had a severe depression, then I think you probably do need to disclose that.
The next comment is from Dr. Aloysia Camilleri. She urged us to reach out for any supports we might need as individuals and as well as an organization.
Thank you very much, Dr. Camilleri. That's very kind of you. And I hope you can all see that, and I hope maybe somebody will put her details in the chat function. So we can do it. So Essa has said it is borderline personality disorder. Thank you, Essa. So I hold out. Borderline personality disorder is probably the commonest personality disorder amongst doctors, but it is still uncommon. And it tends to become manifest about the second year, what we call it, what you do as well, FY2, when you're starting to get some independence. It's more common, we think, in women doctors than male doctors. Are there any tips in order to grow mentally and not attached to patients? Yes, of course, especially when there's guilt involved. Yes, join a Bannock group, join a reflective practice group. It is so difficult, and it's what you learn at medical school, is not to attach to patients, is to learn a healthy detachment. It is the single most important lesson you have to learn, is how to healthily detach from patients. If you take your patients home every single day, metaphorically home, you will not survive. Now, the younger you are, the more inexperienced you are, the more likely you are to take them home with you in your head. But this is where it is so important that if you can form peer support groups, because if you're thinking about that death that you're involved, or by the way, that doesn't mean being non-compassionate. I think about patients and worry about them. Sometimes they come to my head and I think I need to contact them. But on the whole, try and you have to learn a healthy detachment. Otherwise, you will not survive. Mm-hmm. And then there's a question on bipolar disorder by Kay Jameson about her experiences in an unquiet mind. Despite fearing that opening up would harm her professional life, how much has the ability to speak up about mental health within the medical community improved or changed over the past decades? Yes, I've read Kay Jameson's book. It's a very, very good book. And again, I quote it in my book. She had extraordinarily bad bipolar disorder. And in fact, in her book, she saw the same doctor, I think, every week for 20 years. So she also, it's an American system. She had a very, very good system in America. She came out about her illness, but it took her a long time to come out, and she was deeply shamed by it. And she went through a lot of problems before she came out. On the whole, I think it is important to speak about mental health, but I often say, be careful about speaking too much unless you want to speak about your piles or your fibroids or your heavy periods. Once you speak about it, you can't put it back, and there will still be stigma. There will still be people that will say, I don't want to employ someone because you've got bipolar disorder, you're going to be off sick for a long time, etc., etc. And I think Kay Jameson was actually a specialist in bipolar disorder, so there's something very paradoxical about doctors getting the illnesses that they are specialists in. I don't know what 95 star means, by the way.
I think she was just correcting the year instead of 1993.
Oh, sorry.
Can
I just say that is a perfect example of perfectionism. Bella, that is a perfect example of perfectionism.
There you go, Ben.
One of the doctors, sadly, who killed herself, wrote a suicide note and made a spelling error on her suicide note. So crossed it off and wrote the right spelling. And you think, what in God's name was she doing, worrying about spelling error on her suicide note? So just a little warning to you, Belle, that is perfectionism. Nobody would have noticed that it was 1995 and not 1993.
I think that's all there is for questions. She wrote, not a medical student though. Haha, thank you so much for your answer.
Who said that?
Um,
Oh, Belle. All right. So what is this called? I'll just say the support group. So it's Balint, B-A. I'll put it in the, I'm assuming everybody can see Balint groups. They are the best thing. Now, if you, because everything's online now, you can probably join these online. They're right across the world. And I think that they're very, very good. I also think, by the way, Petra, that mindfulness is very, very good. I'm just saying it's for people who like that way of interacting. Lots of studies to show how effective it is, and lots of studies that show it can positively affect mental health and stop burnout.
I think that is all for questions.
Hang on, I'm just going to...
There's a few more. Petra told you, thank you, Dr. Gerada. I am actually a mindfulness trainer, and I do see that it is those who are motivated to meditate and practice slowing down and self-compassion who do well. However, there are cautions before enrolling people, like no recent trauma, which is not recommended, and surely you cannot force it on a person who is not willing to use his time for self-reflection.
And that's right, Petra, but in this study, in the American study, the medical students were forced to engage in mindfulness practice, and I think that's what it showed you. If you're forced to do something, it has a negative effect. Can I say how much I've enjoyed this hour? And if you do repeat it and we have the end of lockdown, maybe I can come to Malta next year. I'm meant to be coming soon, but I don't think that's going to happen. And good luck to everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerada, for joining us. I don't think there are any remaining questions. All information that we discuss now, I will put in the event description. That answered all of your questions. Thank you, Dr. Gerada, for joining us. We really enjoyed it. And thank you to Newsbook and 103, and especially Miss Maria Kaluz for all your help for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it with us. Please join us on our next episode. More information will be released soon. And look out for the feedback form, which will be sent to your emails to let us know any feedback that you may have from today. Thank you.
I hope to see everybody on Thursday. Nice to have a Maltese contingent there. So take care, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.